Before everyone has dinner is probably one of the most challenging sessions to do, especially if you've had a long day when you started at 6 o'clock in the morning and it's 8:30. But I'm going to try and make this session as interesting as possible. It's not one of those sessions where I'm kind of telling you this is how you do it or this is how you don't do it. I'm just trying to say, hey, there's a different mindset, and that mindset has kind of made a certain country and a certain set of people very, very successful. How do you kind of imbibe that mindset? So my session is about building innovative startups. All of you here, I'm assuming the fact that you're here is because either you want to build a great startup or you're with a startup, etc. So building innovative startups with the Israeli mindset. And as I speak about this session, few disclaimers. This is completely non-political. And the second disclaimer is, there is a particular mindset. It may apply to some of your work. It may not apply to some of your work. So just keep that in mind. It's just a little different way of thinking. Before I start, I just want to understand the landscape of the people here. How many of you already have a startup of your own? Great. How many of you want to set a startup? Oh, wow. Almost everybody. How many of you don't want to set up a startup, just want to work with any company? Great. Okay, so great. So majority wants to set a startup, so I think this thing will be really interesting. How many of you know where Israel is? Okay, so is there a pointer on this? That's where Israel is. It's really, really tiny, somewhere off the Mediterranean Sea, 22,000 square kilometers, which is, if you were to take a country as the size of a country, probably maybe 5 times or 6 times the size of Singapore. But this is what it is. I'll give you some more facts about it. Its population is 9.2 million people. It's got a GDP of about 352 billion people, but most importantly, it has the maximum number of startups per capita, which is 1 startup for every 1,400 people, and it also has the best startup ecosystem anywhere in the world, which means it has the best exits that are there anywhere in the world. Okay? So this is a quick fact. The capital of Israel, Tel-Aviv, is the second most innovative city anywhere in the world. So you have a whole bunch of cities across Europe, Asia, etc., but Tel Aviv beats all of that. It has the highest number of startups that are listed on the NASDAQ right after the US. So more than China, more than any European country, more than anything else. It has the most scientists and engineers per capita. And again, as I said, the largest number of startups per capita. This is a very interesting slide. Anyone here can tell about your country's exits, which means when you start up, essentially, one of the big goals of people who start up is, at the end of the day, you'd like to have an exit. What is an exit? Can anyone define what an exit is? Okay, when somebody comes and acquires. Any other way of an exit? IPO. Any other exit? Acqui-hire. Any other exit? Exactly, an M&A, right? So these are exits. So as you have startups, the big thing that you want to do, because that's your metric, one of your metrics of success, is you want to have an exit. Israel by far has the most number of exits. So if you actually go and do some research on Israeli venture capital firms, every VC firm that you see, and you see its portfolio of customers, of startups, 50% of them would have already been acquired or would have had exits. This is the slide on which you can see the average exit per year of Israeli startups. Look at 2016, $9 billion of exits. This is not investment. 2017, $23 billion. 2018, $12 billion. And 2019, just till now, approximately $14 billion. That is what you call the measure of success. It's a small country, and this is what it's doing. It's more than any of the countries that are sitting here. More than India. India, for example, India, last year was the year we saw our highest exit. And that was primarily because of which company? Exactly. So other than that, if you really measure exits, India has not really reached that spot where we are having like consistent exits, because we are still in that ecosystem. And that's one of the big reasons where I'm going to start saying, how do you build that kind of mindset? These are some of the companies that are notable exits. Look at the slide. Can you all see these logos? Okay. Not many of these slides are very noticeable. You all may not know most of these slides. How many of you all know Mobileye? Okay. Mobileye got sold to Intel in 2017 for $15 billion. What does Mobileye do? All of us know autonomous driving, right? So Mobileye kind of pioneered the autonomous driving. So in today's BMWs or let's say Mercedes, etc., if you're driving on the highway, if you're driving on an expressway, and you veer off the lane, the Mobileye technology will bring you back on the lane. 2017, Intel bought Mobileye for $15 billion. How many of you know Viber? Yeah, Israeli technology. How many of you use WhatsApp? Israeli technology. Like, I can go on. Okay, the fact that all of us can sit in this room and speak to our friends, family, and parents at home is because of something called VoIP. That's how Viber, everything, developed in Israel. How many of you have used Waze? Israeli technology, acquired by a larger competitor, Google. So in this scene here, you will start seeing that Israelis, when they build startups, they don't really build those huge, big startups, but they build startups that actually get acquired. And they get acquired for larger amounts of money. Oh my God. Yeah. So this is the startup ecosystem in Israel. I think it's a really small slide. But essentially, what Israel has built is a huge startup ecosystem. The startup ecosystem has government support, has industry that's participating, has a huge VC community, has competitive structure, has an empowerment structure, and also has the structure of the military, where everybody who's a young Israeli goes into the military at a formative age of the same age that many of you guys are, and then spends 3 years there. There's a difference. Singapore has this exact same startup ecosystem. They also go to the military, they also do all of this, they also have government support, VC, everything. But you don't hear Singapore's startup ecosystem being so different. And I'll tell you why. The reason is this. When Israel was formed less than 75 years ago, Israel did not exist as a nation. So actually, you guys if you Google it, it's called a startup nation. It did not exist, and they started. Once they started, they were in a conflict zone. You know, even till today, the conflict is not resolved. So they don't have any friendly neighbors. They're surrounded by countries like Syria and a whole bunch of other countries, so they don't have any friendly neighbors. As a result of which, they can't trade. Whenever all of us think, whenever all of us are doing startups, whenever all of us are thinking through these things, we're thinking locally in our own area, how can we solve a problem there? They can't solve any problems there because they're a really small country. So they have to think out of the box, they have to think out of the country. They had no natural resources, which means no water, no oil, no nothing, but they all had to survive. They had to build its own military capability because, again, they were always constantly under attack. And they had to be completely self-reliant. What happened? Essentially, they started to look inside and they started to become survival. They went back to the basics and they said, we have to do everything that we can survive. What did they do? They started, in order to kind of build farming, etc. They started to build great farming techniques. Today, Israel teaches India how to farm more productively. Israel has about 23 center of excellences in India, teaching Indians and Indian farmers how to farm more productively because they've been able to do that. If you all have heard of something called drip irrigation, it was invented in Israel, brought to India and to most other countries, farming techniques. Converting salt water or converting water into reusable water because they don't have any water, Israel again leads that. Anybody can tell me how much of water, what percentage of water is reused in Israel? 86% of their wastewater is reused. The closest competitor is Spain, where they use 26%. Countries like India would be less than 3 to 4%. And we have a huge water problem. It's the basic survival instinct or the necessity that has caused them. So that has now sunk into entrepreneurs and into youngsters like you and I to say, how do we build startups and great startups? So going back to the DNA of the young Israeli entrepreneur, he's challenging. Because when you have to survive, when you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, if you're going to be put on a border and you're going to be there, you have to survive. So you will challenge everything. They have strong drive. They knock on every door and every opportunity to solve it, because if they don't solve it, they won't exist the next day. They are solution-driven. They build startups in a more cost-effective manner. Again, lack of resources. They go global from inception, no neighbors, so they have to go global. They learn from their mistakes. They tolerate failure. Again, because at the end of the day, if I don't exist tomorrow, I have to constantly try changing my strategy, learning from my mistakes. I don't give up. And essentially, they have a very short history. They're 75 years old, so there is no legacy. There are no fifth generation, sixth generation people telling you what to do. Everyone is a young entrepreneur. And that's the DNA now that I want to kind of come back and say, hey, as youngsters, can you all build that DNA into this thing? So how can we apply that mindset while building innovative startups? What is this? Evolution, right? So now start thinking like this. At the end of the day, all of us, we can think differently, we can everything, but we're basically animals, right? And when you think like that, and when you think from that perspective, you start thinking, hey, if I'm an animal, what do I need to do to survive, and what do I need to do to thrive? And once you start thinking that way, it completely changes the mindset of the game. Because today what we do is we filter everything, right? When you look at the ecosystem of a forest, you have lions, you have deers, you have rats, you have everything. Everyone is competing to survive. Now, in the survival ecosystem, the rat will still eat and it will survive. But if a lion needs to protect its territory, it needs to eat and it also needs to protect its territory. So within that survival ecosystem, start thinking, how do I excel to survive? Because that's what's going to make startups great. When you look at it today and you look at startups that are all over the place, it's the startups that excel are the biggest things. How many of you, again, back to a question, how many of you don't use Gmail? Probably one person. Why? Because Gmail has built that kind of level of what we call Mafia product, or that level of such a superior product that everyone will use that product. So when you start thinking that kind of survival, you'll start thinking, hey, how do I get everybody to use my product? So survival, start imbibing, and I'll come back to this point a little later. The next thing is the military mindset. Anybody who's in Israel, at the age of 16, a young man or a young lady has to go into the military compulsory. And when you go into the military, you're actually thrown on the border, which is a conflict zone. So if you take it easy, you will get shot. You will die. It's as simple as that. It's not like another ecosystem wherein, let's say in Singapore again, you go into the military, but you sit in comfortable air-conditioned rooms. There, you are on conflict zones. It's almost war all the time. So they have to be prepared. That level of responsibility starts coming in at that age of 17, 18, where you kind of have to build that military mindset. It also builds the mindset of something called collaborative winning. Because when you're in the army, you're with a lot of your colleagues, and you become responsible and you start taking care of other people as well, and you start getting that DNA into it. So that's the military mindset. It's a mindset with discipline, a mindset with courage, with purpose, a mindset to survive, and a mindset to win. Many of us have not had that opportunity to go through military mindsets, but we have to say, go back, read, research, build that military mindset, because when you want to set a startup, if you don't have that military mindset, it becomes very difficult. They have that advantage, okay? The second is something called Hutzpah. Hutzpah is very unique to the Israeli culture. Again, Google it when you get the time and write it down. Write this down. Chutzpah. Essentially, when you define it, it is the quality of audacity, and whether for good or bad, it's basically cheekishness. It's like, in many of our systems, if our superiors or our teachers say something wrong, we don't have the guts to question. In the Israeli Hutzpah, you will question. You will push boundaries. You will do anything. And that's what the culture of Hutzpah creates, a certain risk-taking, can-do attitude where Israelis see an opportunity in everything. It's not disrespect. It's Hutzpah. You push the boundaries with respect, and you challenge everything. And that's something that's, again, helped them get there. This is something different. You would have heard it all over the place that they'll say, think global, act local. When you look at Gmail, is it local? When you look at anything that you use today in your ecosystem, is it local? Then why are you thinking local? The world has changed. Think global, act global. That's what Israel did, because they didn't have any local ecosystem, right? From the day one, when they build products, they build it for the globe. They build it for US, they build it for Europe, they build it for Asia, they build it for every other place. Because they didn't have an option. Go back whenever you go back, challenge yourself and say, how can I start thinking global? With even my local ideas, how can I start thinking global? All of us, and I've seen a lot of those ecosystems and a lot of the maps that we have been drawing, we're thinking in our own country, we're thinking in our own restricted borders, we are thinking in our own little area. But go back and say, what do I use? I use everything that's global. So how can I start building global stuff? Even if it's local, how can I start building it in a global way? So think global, act global. This is another interesting concept. It's called building Mafia products. Okay? So talk about Gmail, talk about WhatsApp, talk about everything else. In our ecosystems today, almost in everything, we're in a space where the winner takes all. So it's almost become like a Mafia product. And if you go back to that earlier slide of the Israeli acquisitions, they are not brands that you recognize. But why did they get acquired for $15 billion? Because they were Mafia products. Because the Intel knew it couldn't survive without that innovation. All the larger companies knew they couldn't grow without that kind of innovation. So they had to buy these Mafia products out. When you think of your startup, start thinking, how can it be Mafia? You know the word Mafia? It's the Italian word where the guy puts the gun on your head and says, give me your money. Okay? Here you have to think of it, gun on the head, and say, give me your business. Right? And it's in a way that people, whether you're a customer, why do you use Gmail? Because you know if you don't use Gmail, you will be left out. If you don't use WhatsApp, you will be left out. It's Mafia product. Start thinking, how do I build Mafia product? Again, all of us talk about failure. But in many of our cultures, failure is like shunned on. Okay? We are very, very afraid to fail. In the Israeli culture, failure is actually embraced. So here's how it works. If you want 500, and this is serious, if you want $500,000 in the Israeli ecosystem, the government gives you that money. There are about 50 accelerators. You go to any of these accelerators, you get selected, the government will give the accelerator $500,000, you'll get it. So you accelerate your product, you reach it to a certain level, it works, everything, then you take it to market, you get a certain audience, etc. You want to scale, then you go back and you incubate your product. You want $2 million. The government of Israel again will give you that $2 million, again through a whole bunch of incubators. Okay? Again, you grow. You want more money. You want $5–10 million. You go into the Israeli VC ecosystem and you ask for the money. They won't ask you, they will ask you about your pedigree, but they will ask you mainly, how many times have you failed? How have you failed? What have your failures been? What have you done? If you've not failed, they'll actually tell you to go back, fail. They'll say, go back, try more, because we don't think you're ready for this kind of scale. So you come back. So failure is actually embraced. In Israel, they have this concept called fuck-up nights, okay? Wherein they have meetups where people who failed, as much as I'm saying, Israel is a great ecosystem, 98% of startups in Israel fail. 98%. But they embrace it. They come to fuck-up nights, and they talk about their failures and how they failed. All of us will go through that process while we build our startups. Don't give up. Again, if you have that Israeli mindset, if you have that military mindset, if you fail, unless you're dead, you're still alive to go the next day and fight the battle. So think of it that way. It's okay to fail, but I'll learn from that failure, else I will fail to learn. So learn that. Failure is okay. Learn from that failure. Embrace that failure. Even if your cultures don't encourage failure, it's your mindset. And this is all about building this mindset internally. And finally, it's about collaborativeness. Again, the whole part of the military. A lot of us who run startups work in silos, and we don't collaborate. Here, in the Israeli ecosystem, people collaborate. They may compete fiercely, but they'll also collaborate collectively, because they're a small nation, and as a small nation, they need to win across. So they will collaborate collectively. Learn to start collaborating, and if you won, if you've succeeded, start mentoring. Everybody in this room can mentor. If you've been here for 4 days, it means you've learned. It means there's somebody back home who you can teach. Today, you can go back and teach them. Because when you give, you will get back. As you take 2 steps forward, you learn more, go back and teach. Because when you teach, somebody else will see and will teach you, and you'll learn. Mentoring in Israel is not done like mentoring in many other parts of the world. In many parts of the world, mentoring is done by a person who's become very, very successful. He'll stand on the stage and he'll say, I did this, and I did this, and I did that. That's not how mentoring is done there. Mentoring is actually, I'm 2 steps ahead of you, and I'll look back and I'll say how I took these 2 steps, and I'll take you along those 2 steps. Go back and do that. By virtue of you all being here in this room, you all are actually 2 steps ahead of many of your colleagues. Go back and teach them. Collaborate, mentor, learn, and give back. So this is basically the process that many Israeli companies follow. And this mindset is something that you can also look at. You start up, you accelerate quickly. You have an idea, you accelerate it quickly. You set a deadline, 6 months, 8 months, 9 months. Accelerate it quickly. Build a product, do the MVP, get your first few paying customers, accelerate it quickly. Within that 6, 8, 9 months, that deadline that you've set, decide. Decide whether you're going to continue or decide whether you're going to kill. Because many a time, we'll start up and then we'll go and go and go and go, right? Because we don't have that survival instinct. We need to get that survival instinct and say, hey, I'm going to decide quickly whether I'm going to keep or I'm going to kill. Once you do that, then so that's the part where you validate and then you decide. Then you incubate. So now you know it's working, you incubate for scale, okay? And you start making it grow. You start growing it across borders, you start growing it, etc. And finally, you then decide. You look for exits, you look for everything. You finish that cycle and go and start up again. And that's how most Israeli ecosystem entrepreneurs do. They're called serial entrepreneurs there because they follow this cycle. They start up, they accelerate, they validate, they incubate, they scale, they exit. Okay? Do the same thing. As I come to the end, this is what Warren Buffett talked about the Israeli ecosystem. He said, if you're going to the Middle East to look for oil, you can skip Israel. If you're looking for brains, look no further. Israel has shown that it has a disproportionate amount of brains and energy. In this room, all of us have brains, and all of us have energy. We have energy because we've taken that first attempt to get on a flight, take all that risk, and come here. Start building that DNA, start building that mindset that I will make my startup successful, or I will do that thing. So, in summary, here are the things that you kind of should keep in mind. The hunger to survive and excel, the military mindset, Hutzpah, the can-do attitude, the I give a F attitude, the I'll push the boundaries attitude, I'll take it, build Mafia product, don't be afraid to fail, think global, act global, compete fiercely, collaborate collectively, give back, mentor. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your sharing. And now it's time for you to have the question. All right.
Questions?
Sir, the slide you told about think global, act global.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to ask, is it really true to just start acting global or planning global? Or basically, you were talking about Gmail and WhatsApp. They build products, so right now they're used globally. But somewhere when they started with a small mindset. Even Facebook started with a mindset of connecting a college students among the Harvard University itself. YouTube started just sharing the videos in a small society. So do you really think planning for a global will be useful, or just starting from a small scale and then once you validate it, then going to a global phase will be useful?
So very interesting question, and I think many of you will have the same thing of, hey, I'm looking at stuff like that. So in the previous slide that I talked about that cycle, right, which is startup, accelerate. In that process of acceleration, you will figure out all of this. So Facebook, YouTube, all of these guys figured out very quickly that their products were global. That happens in that validation section, and then they go and incubate for global. So when you think, if you think like, hey, I'm just going to deal with these 10 people around me, I'm just going to do something like that, then the folks in India know this term called jugaad, right? How many of you don't know this term called jugaad? Yeah. So jugaad is frugal innovation, okay? A lot of us jugaad our startups. As much as it's a celebrated word, I disagree with it. I say from the word go, we have to do frugal, but we have to be extremely innovative. Because jugaad breaks. When you scale, jugaad breaks. Jugaad will always be local. If you need to scale, then it has to be innovative. So as much as you're doing it locally, you should always think local to validate in that acceleration phase, but constantly keep in mind that if you really want exits, if you really want to build innovative startups, if you really want to do stuff, you need to think global and you need to act global as well. Start doing that from day one. And that's what will kind of build that DNA. You may fail once, you may fail twice, but when you get to the end, right, you will actually build a global product which will be accepted globally. Very often, Israeli startups, they will fail in one market, they will fail in the second market, but they'll actually win in some other market which they have no idea. And it'll come back to them and they'll start winning there. And that's what happens when you think global and you act global. So it's important to do that. Do all of that local stuff in that acceleration and that validation phase right up in the beginning, and then you kind of incubate global.
Thank you. And the next question? Over there.
It is really nice to know how Israeli people think in terms of scarcity. If we want to do practical application of scarcity, and if you want to simulate in your running business, what are the ways you could tackle it? What I'm thinking is, like investment banking would do a stress test and see how parts of the processes fail. If you never had an idea of the system that Israelis are employing, but now you have your business and you go back home or to your company and you start maybe putting every individual areas to test, how would you go about doing it? Are there many more ways for a startup to experience this survival mode? Do you suddenly maybe switch off the funds? Do you plan scenarios of something failing? What is your take on that? Real world practical adoption strategies for this.
Very interesting question. Thank you for asking that question, because that keeps coming in my mind, right? Honestly, if you've not really been through that, and some of the parts I've really not explained, but some of the magic in Israeli mindset or the Israeli success is what you call the Israeli mother, right? Most of them have been through multiple wars, not seen food on the table. When they came to Israel, the day they landed, they started with a war. Many of them have come from multiple other parts of the world. They've seen real nothings. And that's what drives them to drive their children from when they're very, very young to survive and to thrive. And it is difficult to simulate that. Empathy can't come if you really not had that real day of absolute no food for 5 days, 6 days, right? Whatever said and done in our ecosystems, even if we fail, we go back to our mothers, and our mothers will put food on the table, right? And that, unfortunately, there didn't happen. So sometimes we have to we have to force ourselves to think in a very, very different way. This is what we call the basics, but start thinking in different ways for your organization, because when your organization is there and you have maybe your customer right next door who you can validate it for, or you have opportunities next door, you take it for granted. Start pushing yourself and not taking things for granted, and then you will kind of get back into that ecosystem wherein you can say, hey, how do I push myself? So it's difficult, but you have to push yourself for it.
Okay, the last question. Thank you.
Tell me your name, where you're from, when you guys ask these questions.
I'm from India.
Okay.
Delhi.
Okay. Hi, Rahuel.
Yeah. So there are two types of innovation.
Yeah.
One is product innovation. The other is process innovation.
Yeah.
The majority of startups you described from the Israel, they were majorly focused on product innovations. How effective is a process innovation to take a product globally?
So, again, if you actually, I've showcased a lot of Israeli innovations, which are product innovations. But if you actually go into the ecosystem and see process, they have a lot of startups that are into process innovation. And many of them have kind of worked in other companies around the world, etc. And they see gaps in that process. And they think through it with their whole frugal mindset and with their innovative mindset, and they come back and build innovation in that space. If you actually Google, if you go to Google and Google Industry 4.0 process innovation, you will see a lot of Israeli companies in that space. So you can drive innovation anywhere if you just look at it very differently. You guys went through that design thinking mindset, right, yesterday? The design thinking workshop. This mindset you have to apply one step before you do that design thinking mindset. Put that mindset of, hey, I have, regardless of what, I'm going to have the hunger to survive and win. And then go back and say, this is what I'm going to do. Because if you have that hunger to survive and win, and then you put this mindset, you will start, you can put it in any space, anywhere. Literally, I'll talk to you about another Hutzpah moment. How many of you have heard of this company called SodaStream? Nobody. Google SodaStream. SodaStream. Israeli company. All they did, the Indians in this room will know something called Dr. Butler. Dr. Butler? The youngsters? Okay, so Dr. Butler was basically a soda machine. You put a bottle inside and it'll add carbon dioxide into it. Push, you would, and it'll just add carbon dioxide. That is SodaStream. It just added carbon dioxide into water. Okay, that's exactly what you do. Your Coca-Colas and your Pepsis basically are aerated with that. To that, they added a range of flavors which they could kind of add to that. But the marketing chutzpah that was there actually went up against Pepsi and Coke. So they had marketing campaigns that every time you pressed a SodaStream button, you were actually demolishing rows and rows of Pepsi and Cokes in supermarket aisles, and you were being environmentally friendly. One would think Pepsi and Coke would come and just eat them up for breakfast. Pepsi acquired SodaStream last year for $3.2 billion. That's chutzpah. And that's in a space which is B2C, which is this, which is that, absolutely nothing. So there are hundreds of innovative ideas, and I can keep talking about these stories, where chutzpah or any of these values that I talked about applied, went against the big guy, won.